In the news this week, curators of the world's most extensive collection of Tudor objects, the Mary Rose Museum, have been heavily criticised. They've been ascribing questionable LGBT origins to objects found on Henry VIII's famous ship, or, as they put it, using queerness as an interpretive tool. For example, the museum website argues that a mirror found on the ship can relate to queer people as they may experience gender dysphoria or euphoria when looking into it. And a collection of knit combs is linked to gender identity because of the norm that women have long hair and men have short hair. These interpretations are, to put it charitably, hugely speculative, forcing the present onto the past and distorting it into a fiction. That led me to wonder, is it unethical for museum curators to rewrite the past? And that is the subject of tonight's duel. Joining me tonight is the broadcaster Rafe Heydel-Mankoo and the former MP Stephen Pound, two of my favourite people. How lucky am I? Rafe and Stephen, thank you so much for joining us here today.
How lucky are we, actually?
So, Stephen, kick us off. Do you think that this is not just wrong, but unethical?
Yeah, well, I think this is profoundly wrong, and I think we've actually reached a stage now where we simply have to say this far and no further. I think we are actually, this is asinine, it is puerile, it's also inchoate, it makes no sense whatsoever. Look, let's get a couple of things straight. They've actually found a mirror. Well, I have to say, that doesn't mean necessarily that the place was full of gay men preening in the mirror. There's a lot of women on board Henrikian warships. You know the expression, show a leg? You know where that comes from, don't you?
I don't.
Well, because the women would be in the hammock, with a sailor overnight, and in the morning, when you piped all hands on deck, they used to say, show a leg to see if it was a man or a woman in the hammock, or sometimes...
See, that would have been an interesting bit of history for them to include in.
Well, that would be interesting, but the other thing is about men having long hair. Henrikian sailors, right up until the Nelsonian times, had very long hair. The reason that we wear that collar, that Nelson collar, was to keep the tar, the tallow off our uniforms. And we used to plait, I mean, not in my day, I have to say, but, ancestors used to do that. So, but look, what's ridiculous about this is about trying to identify and find queerness. And I think you put it beautifully earlier on when you talked about people detached from reality. If you can afford to live up on the top of the hill, doesn't mean you occupy the moral high ground. And these people are actually twisting themselves and tying themselves into knots to desperately try to justify their own prejudices and their own failings, their own academic incompetence. I don't mind them doing that. They can do that in any dinner party in Dartmouth Park for all they care. But I object to what they're doing to our country, to our people, to our culture and to our standards, and actually making us look as though we are somehow guilty for not identifying gay sailors on the Mary Rose. Well, I'll go to my grave defending the right of gay men to be gay men, gay women to be gay women, but I'm not going to say if there's a mirror there, that equals, 2/3 of the ship's crew were of that persuasion.
Rafe, they are reading into this, aren't they? So there is surely a history that they could have actually highlighted, but this is something that they are reading into it, that they are imposing on the past. But they would say that the reason why they're doing this is for inclusivity, so that people can see themselves in the collection. Do you think that people should need to see themselves in the collection? No,
I mean, well, it was quite clear that I would be very open and happy to see an exhibition about the history of homosexuality, whether it be, James I's Royal Favourites or the Molly houses of the 17th century in London, and, the history of Polari, because that's real history. What we're talking about here is fantasy history. The very notion of queerness is a 20th century creation. Queerness is a very political term. It's loaded. It's the advancement of an ideology and of an activism, which is very different to just being gay. So that's one of the key issues I have here. But on its own, this is a very silly story, I would say. But taken more broadly, this is very sinister. This is the attempt to subvert reality to advance a political agenda, and I think we have to actually call a spade here. Britain is a post-revolutionary society now. We may not have red flags flying from the tops of our grand buildings, but the people who inhabit those buildings and run them are cuckoos in the nest who bear no resemblance to the generations who built them and ran them. And our museums are actually at the core and centre of this, and the biggest cuckoos are actually museum curators and librarians. When we were growing up, librarians and museum curators were shy, introverted, meek people They're now the stormtroopers of woke ideology. And the problem here, of course, is that children today get so little history at school. They know about the Tudors, they know about the Nazis and Windrush. Beyond that, they don't get anything. So it's museums that provide the main educational service, not just for the young, but also for the adults. British adults are very ignorant of history too. But instead of providing the accurate and balanced history they should be giving, they are reinforcing the indoctrination that children are getting at school.
Do you think that's the problem, Stephen, that we don't even have the resilience in the population in terms of historical literacy to be able to recognise lies when we see them? So it's the same with Lincoln's Inn, that there's a kind of illiteracy there. There's no understanding of why these things are important and why, from a Christian perspective, I know you're also a Christian, why honesty matters.
I think that one thing Christianity teaches you is self-examination. And one thing is because we live our lives in imitation of Christ, hopefully, but we also need to examine our own motivations and our own urges and our own motivations. And I think that Lincoln's Inn, and let's not forget, you talked about Fortescue, and I think only on GB News can we have a discussion about Sir John Fortescue. But I'd also mention St Thomas More, who was also at Lincoln's Inn, who actually died for his faith and died to preserve the independence of the judiciary. I think that we don't have that strength anymore, and we've allowed those with the lauded voices to dominate too much. And because you can shout louder doesn't mean that you can actually express yourself better. I wish we had more confidence, but as for the shy librarian, I can think of probably one of the greatest poets of the last century was a shy librarian in Hull who spent most of his life. Philip Larkin, who was certainly not a quiet librarian.
Brief final thoughts, Ray?
No, well, I agree, but I think we have to wake up to the fact that what's happening here is systemic across all of our institutions, and we need to have a muscular defence of Western civilization to defend us from the enemies within, but also from without, of course, because we have very strong aggressors in China and Russia and elsewhere, and it's only strength that defeats strength.
Thank you both for a very intelligent disagreement.
Well, I'm sorry.
Or not really disagreement, an intelligent agreement.
I will try to find something to argue about with Rafe.
Thank you so very much, both of you, for
well
dueling
moderated,
there.
Emma.